I came to UNO, I'd learned all that stuff already. So there was really no surprise when I came to UNO. I knew exactly what to expect. I think the surprise came in my first job as a full-time person at Sauk Valley Community College when you think you know everything, but you don't. You know?
I have known today's guest for over 15 years at this point, and it has been so cool to follow along with his path through the music world. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Jeremy Baguyos, who I first met in the Des Moines Metro Opera. My wife was playing harp in that ensemble, and I would go and hang out, and I even played for a couple of seasons, and it was really interesting to learn about Jeremy's background and interests and how he just thought a little differently than a lot of the other musicians in that group. So he made this really interesting pivot into the world of computer music. We're going to get into that, his whole career path, and just lots of great stories and memories and funny and poignant things, and you're just going to love it. By the way, and we talk about this, Jeremy had me out to UNO to do a talk on music entrepreneurship and work with some bass students this fall, and it was just a blast. You're going to love this conversation. And a quick shout out to our sponsors, the Bass Violin Shop, A440 Violin Shop, Modacity and Coda, Colstein Music, Steve Swan String Bass, D'Addario Strings, and Upton Bass. More on them later. And we're going to play a couple of short excerpts just to give you an idea of what Jeremy does on the bass. We're going to have an excerpt from Ripped Up Maps for double bass and computer, composed by Andrew May, performed by Jeremy, and an excerpt for One More Time with Feeling for double bass and computer, and this was composed by Jeremy. Here we go with our conversation with Jeremy Baguyos. It's cool. They've got this hall that they built maybe 2-3 years ago. George Quinlan, who owns this big music retailer, Quinlan and Fabish, they built a hall, and it's really cool. It's like this old train repair facility. So it's kind of like this funky kind of black box sort of thing. It's really interesting.
Is it right next to the building?
It's right next to the building. Yeah.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeez, I was just in Chicago a couple of days ago, so all the Chicago memories are just rushing back, and they were all good memories because I was only there intermittently in and out for about 10 months, and so that's not enough to hate the place. Like anytime you play in an orchestra for 1 year, that's your best memory because you haven't been around long enough to be annoyed by it. That's why I have such great memories of the Quad Cities Symphony, even though everyone tells me all you had to do was stay one more year and you would have hated it just like us. We're not recording, are we?
Well, you heard my talk. Yes, but no.
Okay.
At a certain point, I guess we start, but I don't think I have my little system. I got my pad and I've got my red. I've switched my pencil to red, and then at some point it's like, I guess we started the podcast. But you can put in the stuff about Quad City Symphony. I really did enjoy my year there. It was really a weird year, but I did enjoy it. And but I was only around for a year. So now I saw you post about that art installation.
Oh yeah, it's State and Adams,
and I believe that was like 2004-ish, somewhere around that.
February 2004. It was just a turning point for me creatively, and only because it was something that I did outside of school. Because everything in school is, it's school, it's a very controlled environment, but then you get outside of school and it just means different. Meant something differently to me. And just because the people I was collaborating with were just like Rob Drinkwater over at the Chicago Art Institute. And there were so many people involved in making it happen, like M.W. Burns, a sound artist, and the Hyde Park Art Center, of course. They're the ones that actually foot the bill for everything. And that was just a fantastic thing. It didn't last as long as it should have because some jerk climbed up there and stole all the speakers, all 32 of them.
How did that
Chicago?
Well, right. How did that opportunity come about? That'd be a fun place to start. Actually, we could talk about that, and then like your career path, which I find fascinating. I'm sure everybody finds fascinating. And then I do want to talk about computer music because I think I have a very limited knowledge, but I think it's interesting and what you did at ISB. And there's way too much to talk about right now, so we'll have to do a round two at some point. We'll just talk about what we cover, but
we'll just talk whatever.
Okay, perfect. Well, so talk about that project.
Oh, that project. It's a public sound installation. So the idea with public sound art is that you're supposed to create art that activates a space. That's the key word, activating a space. So it can be static, meaning that it doesn't have to change over time like a music composition. But the idea is that when people walk underneath the sound canopy, the 32 speakers that were suspended over State and Adams, we were supposed to change their experience, their everyday experience, even though they were only going to be under it for about 35, 40 seconds. And it was really neat because I attempted to enhance the sounds that were already there, which was the traffic, the horns, occasional cars screeching. And so I put in a few extra. And the neat thing was watching people jump and spin around like they were about to. And I shouldn't have done that, but it made the piece, it really activated the space, even though it made people kind of shocked. But it really was. There was a lot of white noise that blended in with the white noise generated artificially that blended in with the white noise of the traffic. And there used to be like a McDonald's like right near there. It's not there anymore. It moved. And I could kind of hang out there and watch people, and I could see the reactions. And I'm thinking, I am touching so many people's lives without them knowing it. And I'm affecting them in a certain way. And I don't know if I was able to do that with my bass as part of a symphony orchestra. I didn't get that same rush. And so that was a turning point for me, because it's like, I know it had nothing to do with the bass. I was still a bass player at the time, but it was taking something that I learned in school, a bunch of techniques, and actually applying it to something that changed people somehow, changed their experience. And so I thought I did my job at that point. Yeah, and just hanging out with all those guys in Chicago. The experimental scene there is very unheralded and not talked about enough. They should be talking about the Chicago experimental scene like we talk about New York. Really, I think it's better, but don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone from New York. Whoops, too late.
Well, I got a soft spot in me for all things Chicago, of course. And I was living in Chicago at the time, which most people probably realize. And I've actually known Jeremy since, I want to say 2001, 2002, something like that. From my wife was playing in the Des Moines Metro Opera, where you're principal bass, and have been there for a while. And I came out and subbed a couple of performances. I subbed one season, and then you took a year off, and I filled in for principal bass. So I got to know you then, and I knew you as a DC area freelancer. And then I also had heard, or you'd mentioned that you'd gotten a master's in computer music or something in that field. Okay, which I thought, well, that's interesting that this bass player is doing. And then fast forward a little bit, and you've gone on this academic journey, which seemed cool and interesting. And now you've been at University of Nebraska Omaha for quite a while, teaching bass, but also teaching computer music and presenting at bass conventions and all that kind of thing. So what an interesting path. I don't even know where to start. Let's go back. Talk about when you got onto the bass and maybe your journey toward Indiana University, where you ended up going for.
Oh, that far back?
Yeah, let's go way back.
Oh, geez. When I used to do interviews for academic positions, they would ask me the same thing, and I would have to tell them this. I'm sorry, I don't really have an interesting story. It was public school. I was in fourth grade, and it was time to get fourth graders into the orchestra. And so they paraded a bunch of instruments out in front of us, and we all picked one. I was in an interesting school district, though, the Shawnee Mission School District, because I think it was Robert Gillespie was doing research on pull-out theory. I think that's what it's called, where if you pulled kids out of regular curriculum in the middle of the day to make them do orchestra, to see if it would change their test scores negatively. And of course, it just confirmed what we already knew. It's not going to affect our academic performance. Not me, but my parents and other parents. In fact, it made it better. So, of course, it's just correlation. It's not causation, but it was an interesting experiment. And I think the intensity of that research probably made the experience for all of us that much more intense. And I have a feeling it was because of that, because I was a guinea pig, that maybe my education was a little bit better than the average person's. That's my guess. I'm just speculating, but to be honest, there's no story where I saw Gary Carr play and I wanted to play the bass so badly. It wasn't like that at all, even though I love Gary Carr's playing. But that came later. I didn't appreciate his playing until I was much, much older.
So you're one of the rare people who didn't have like a Gary Carr sighting and it changed, because that's me. I was like in South Dakota, so grew up in your general region of the country that you grew up in, a few state boxes away. But music education is good. Shawnee Mission is, what's that close to? What
it's in Overland Park, so it's in the Kansas City suburbs.
Okay. So that, I've always thought of that as a pretty good place for music education in general.
Oh yeah, and it is.
Yeah,
it is. It was. It is, and it's in fact. Yeah. I could go on about how great it was, but I don't think I need to. I just know that I was very lucky to be in a good school district that was very supportive of the arts. The teachers there were very supportive, and I didn't actually take my first real bass lesson until much later. I just went 6 years through that system, but they kept me afloat, improving until I took my first real bass lessons with Misha Kreutz and the Kansas City Symphony.
There we go. Sure.
Most people know him as the guy that owns KC Strings. But he was a bass player and a good one. And I think just listening to him play in the lessons was probably what got me more interested in the bass, I guess. And so.
And did he encourage you to Indiana University is where you ended up? Was that his prompting, or how'd
Not
that
just
pop?
him.
Okay.
Everybody in the at that time, I think everyone in the Kansas City Symphony bass section, besides Misha, had gone to IU. And so, me being an impressionable high school kid, I didn't know anything.
Yep.
And hey, you sound pretty good. You should go to Indiana. I was like, what's that? No, really, I had no idea what Indiana was. And I didn't know that a few years later it would just completely change me in my life and personally, professionally. It's just, I can't divorce myself from what that place has made me. But just a few years before, I didn't know what it was. Yeah. And I should be embarrassed that I didn't know what it was. But yeah, the older bass players have a ability to influence a kid that really doesn't know anything, and I certainly didn't know anything.
It's a big responsibility. I remember my first bass student that I had that went on to music school. His name's Eric Steffens. He's principal bass of an orchestra in Germany now. I remember very clearly the moment he said, "Hey, where do you think I should apply to school?" And just off the top of my head, I rattled off like half a dozen schools. And then those were the places he applied to. And I realized, I just totally without any sort of thought at all. It's just like, I just shaped his, at least a chunk of his future. So I decided to be a little more, I recommended good schools, but I decided to be a little more intentional in future conversations like that.
Yeah. And an interesting thing is that very few people know this little tidbit, because things have come full circle when, I was a kid growing up in Kansas, and I'll admit I was a little bit scared about moving away from home, just like any Midwestern kid. And I was like, are there any places closer I should look at? And one of the Kansas City Symphony guys, I can't remember which one, rattled off ones that are close, UMKC, Wichita, Kansas, University of Iowa, and UNO. It was... And I was like, UNO, what's that? And they go, that's University of Nebraska Omaha. Bill Ritchie teaches up there. And I was like, and then I saw Bill Ritchie's articles in the ASTA magazine. I was like, oh, yeah. And so Bill was a teacher at the time. And so UNO was on my radar as a school to go study. The problem was, when I went to Indiana, it was just like, the tour stopped there pretty much. I fell in love with the place right away. And never auditioned for UNO. So the irony is that many decades later, here I am at UNO as Bill Ritchie's replacement, school where someone in Kansas City told me to look at if I wanted to stay close.
Isn't that crazy? What a small world.
It's weird.
And so you're there teaching bass, but also, your kind of other thing that you do, the computer music. How on earth did you get interested in that? And then I want to get into like more specifically what you do with that. But how did that happen at Indiana? Was that was that like a hobby of yours growing up or in high school, or just when did that come into your life?
Oh, geez. It was just tech was just kind of a natural part of my life. I forget what those early Macintoshes was, and I don't want to date myself, but a long time ago in the 1980s, and I started messing around with MIDI sequencing software. I don't even remember the name of it anymore. I think it was called Mac Concert. Don't even look it up. It probably doesn't even exist on the internet, but I have the old floppy disks. And it wasn't just that, messing around on those. It was that my teachers, again, going back to the Shawnee Mission School District, had computers sitting around for us to goof around on. And so I would do my ear training stuff. So I just got very comfortable with computers and saw them as a neat way to learn, but also to play games, very early games. I don't know if my teachers realized, but I was also playing computer games on their computers, and they didn't seem to care. So it was just part of the culture that I was raised in. I think I watched a lot of Battlestar Galactica, played a lot of D&D, and that seemed to fit the profile of people that go into this field. If you want to believe in that stereotype, at least. So.
Wait, and remind me, who did you study with at Indiana? Were you studying with Bransby?
Yeah,
that's what I thought.
Bruce Bransby.
Okay, so and I also think of Bruce Bransby as somebody who is kind of early in the whole computer thing. I remember going. Oh, yeah. I remember him having all the excerpts sequenced out, and he would have you practice along with them. And having videotaping you in lessons like earlier. I mean, that's more common now, but I just remember thinking he was like Mr. Technology. So it seems like kind of a natural pairing.
He had a lot to do with it too. I mean, it wasn't computer music tech for the sake of music tech. It was more like, this was really what Bruce's attitude was. He said, here's a key to my studio. Come in late at night, learn how to use my recording equipment because you need to learn how to do this stuff. Ask me later if you have any questions. That's how he was. And then he would bug me about, have you learned to use Finale yet? And so he was really very encouraging, not because he wanted me to go into music tech, but he just felt that it was important that the students were versed in the technology and how we could leverage it. And yes, the sequence things, he would make us use those, the sequenced excerpt things.
Yeah, I remember hearing. I only took a few lessons with him myself, but I remember talking with a lot of students who went to Indiana and just talking about the way that he approached things, and that got me all inspired to sequence my own excerpts and practice along with him. And
oh yeah.
So what? How does? And you were a bass performance major.
Yeah, at Indiana I was.
Bruce Bransby. So how does a bass performance major end up going to Peabody for a computer music degree? Computer music masters. Like how did that decision unfold for you?
Well, a lot went into that. I mean, it going back to my early upbringings, I just enjoyed working with technology and music, and it was just kind of something I had to put off to the side because when I went to Indiana, it was like I was just doing too many things. And finally, Bruce said, you got to focus in on one thing. And like, of course, he's the one that's telling me this. Of course, I have to focus in on double bass performance, classical. And so I did. And I don't regret that at all. And so that's all I did. But that interest was just there, and it's been there for a long time. I didn't just get up out of bed one day. Some people think I got up out of bed one day and say, hey, I need to do something else. It was just, it was a mode of expression. My favorite type of stuff in music history class was the electronic stuff. I didn't know why, but I just liked it. And Ken Mitchell, my former stand partner at Des Moines Opera, when I came back from, in a more direct answer to your question, when we came back from the Shreveport Symphony strike of 97, and there were many, that's why I had to give this one a year. I wish it was funny. I came back from that trying to look, I think we were on strike 9 weeks. Yeah. And I was just way too young to be handling that kind of trauma to my career. And I talked to Ken about it afterwards, and because he was on strike with Kansas City Philharmonic. Back when they were having problems before the Kansas City Symphony became really great. And he said, the one thing about strikes is they will change you. And I told Ken, nah, it's not going to change me. I'm still the same old. But I really think it did. It made me think about alternative careers when I was walking the picket line. And I knew that I wanted to go in academia eventually. It's just, I think the strike kind of accelerated that.
What was the timeline for that? Because I know that you were in the Shreveport in the orchestra. Did that come between the degrees? Did that come after the? Okay.
Yeah, I graduated from Indiana, went to Spain for a couple of years in an orchestra there. Came back, tried my hand in first tour of duty in academia. I didn't know what I was doing, so I only lasted a year. So I went back into orchestra playing full time. Fortunately, Shreveport was kind enough to give me a full time job. Full time as defined by ROPA standards, 39-week full time season. But we were pretty much unemployed in the summer, like a lot of ROPA orchestras that had full time corps. And and so that came after my tour of duty in Spain. But this was all before Peabody computer music. And I think, when I was on strike, the only job I had was the Grambling State University, which I was doing part-time. And it was a really nice gig. It paid really well. And, I was starting to put 3 and 3 together going, this isn't bad with these academics and the life they lead. I just never really thought about it. I knew I wanted to do it, but I never really thought of it as something real until now when I was, all of a sudden didn't have a job. So,
What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think made that academia like? What do you think sparked that interest? Like, were you 15 years old and thinking about that? Like, how did?
Oh yeah, I being a professor seemed like a neat kind of life to me.
Yeah,
I don't think of myself as a very smart person, but I do like the lifestyle of smart people, and I think professors are smart, and so to have that identity would be actually kind of cool, But I wasn't the smartest kid, definitely. But in terms of intellectual curiosity, I definitely like to learn, and I was probably the most studious of a lot of a group of people, just studying stuff and learning stuff organically, just because. Didn't mean I was a great student, but I think just intellectually curious, and I appreciated, intellectual rigor and things like that. So I knew academia was in my future. It just didn't seem real to me at the time because I didn't really have any role models. So,
yeah,
I think I left Shreveport. Even though they came back from the strike, and we had a great last year there before I left. So things were going fine for a while, but my wife got a job in D.C.
This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. Whether resetting your sound post, installing a new bridge, or giving your fingerboard one of their precision dressings, the Bass Violin Shop will work with you to improve your setup. They also specialize in resetting necks, repairing cracks, installing new fingerboards, and new bass bars. Whatever your playing needs, they will listen carefully to you and work hard to get the most out of your instrument without blowing your budget. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram.
Hey, Jason Heath, this is Daniel Kimbrough with the Jerry Douglas Band, among others. It's nice to talk to you again, man. I wanted to talk about D'Addario strings for just a second. Any working bass player these days knows that versatility seems to be the key. A lot of folks that we're playing for aren't just playing one type of music, and a lot of times if you're gigging around town, you're playing a different style of music each and every night. The thing I like very much about D'Addario strings is throughout their line, from the Kaplan to the helicore stuff, it's all really useful in different settings. But if I don't have time to change strings to get a particular specific sound that I want, I can get what I need out of just about any of their models. I really like the Kaplans for Arco stuff, and for older, more punchy, straight ahead jazz gigs or even bluegrass gigs. They just don't have a lot of afternote pits zing, and that's really useful, especially in front of microphones in the studio. And again, they just start so easily with the bow. And then right now on my instrument, I have the helicore hybrid string on, and I went away from the helicores for a long time, but I swear, man, they just bow so easily. I don't know if they've changed the damping in them or what it is, but lately I've just been really loving that string, because with the Jerry Douglas Band, we've got a 7-piece band. We've got a full drum kit and 2 electric guitar amps and 2 horn players and a fiddle player that sounds like a Hammond B3 organ. And so I need a lot of sustain. I need a lot of punch. And that's what those helicore hybrids give me. And I will also say that for a few gigs, I've been trying out the Zyx string, which is a synthetic core string, as many of your listeners will probably already know. But the Zyx is a really cool string. It took me a minute to get used to it, honestly, but it's very similar to an obligato, I would think, or maybe even an Ava Perazzi, if those are models of strings that maybe some folks are a little more familiar with. Again, they start easily with the bow, but they have a really cool, just sort of gut-like attack to them. And I'm looking forward to experimenting with those a little more whenever things calm down and I've got time to throw a few different sets on the bass and see what's what. But anyway, I hope that helps. I would also like to add that Lyris and all the folks at D'Addario have been just so kind and gracious. And, you know, anytime I have a question, I get a response literally within, minutes. Anytime I need to order new strings, they're right back to me ASAP. And that's really comforting for a touring musician. I've had them ship things to me on the road. I've had things waiting for me as soon as I got home because I needed to change strings quickly and get to the next tour. So I can't say enough about the people behind the scenes at D'Addario, let alone the quality strings that they produce. I hope you're doing well out there in San Fran, Jason. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks for having me on again. See you later.
This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And there's a lot that goes into being a bass player beyond that initial purchase of a bass. We need bass bows, we need bass covers, we need stands, we need new strings, pickups, wheels, quivers, upgraded gear like tuning machines, end pins, repair parts, all of that. And when someone's looking for some new bass gear or to upgrade something on their bass, I send them to Steve's shop. He's located just south of San Francisco in the Bay Area, and he is the largest dealer in basses between Los Angeles and Canada. That is a big distance, folks. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com, and thank you so much, Steve, for sponsoring the podcast.
That point, and I felt, let's try something different. And so I went to DC and did the freelance thing. That's when we met.
Yep.
And I don't know. Finally, it just clicked. Let's finally check out this computer music stuff for real, not just. And I joined this group called the 21st Century Ensemble. How can I forget them? Jeez. They were an electronic music group, a professional electronic music group in DC. Joined them, and they were all a bunch of graduates from Peabody. And that's really what pushed me over the edge. I mean, I'd been thinking about it, but it's just like, man, I don't want to leave all these gigs because it was hard for me to leave the gigs. That was my identity. That's who I was. That's how I made my money. And then to all of a sudden jump ship to go to grad school in my mid-30s was just like, that didn't appeal to me at all. But I was with all these other Peabody computer music guys who graduated, and it's like I loved what they were doing, and I want to do what they were doing. And I started getting into the music of Robert Black at the time too, and it's like, wow, I love what I've always been a fan of Robert Black, but I guess just a confluence of things, career considerations. I've always loved experimental music and people like Robert Black and Bertram Turetsky and then all of a sudden with these Peabody computer music guys, it all came together. Okay, it's time to take the dive.
So did you say goodbye to the gig scene when you went back into grad school? Did you try to balance things, or was it basically like just stop, hard stop on the gigs, and I am a student now. I'm in computer music.
Going to grad school, even with an assistantship, it costs money.
Yeah.
So no, I didn't stop doing the gigs. More than anything, it actually, I think it was two things. I did stop doing some gigs, and then people just stopped calling me because they thought I quit the bass to become a composer, which really wasn't the case, because calling me a composer was kind of reductionist. I was going into computer music, of which composition certainly is one outcome of computer music study, but I wasn't really in it to compose computer music, although I have done and I will do it and continue to do it. I didn't want to think of myself as just a composer. It was kind of weird, rattling, that people didn't think of me as a bass player anymore, but the people that really knew me well still called me for gigs, So it was okay.
So were you always composing? Well, I mean, had you thought of yourself as a composer prior to that point? I'm sure, like, if you're sequencing things on the computer, probably compositions occurred at the very least. I mean, did you write music much prior to going to Peabody?
No, not really. I think I just thought of myself as a creative type. I liked improvisation, so you can't call improvisation composition, but I was definitely, I was always looking for another creative outlet besides just playing the 15 excerpts that you have to prepare to do auditions and the weekly stuff that they put on my stand to play, which, in a group like the Shreveport Symphony, most of it was not masterworks. It was, oh, geez. I don't know. There are just some pop tunes that I can't believe how many times I played it. And I practiced 4 hours a day for this, but the Masterworks concerts made up for it, definitely. Yeah, but well, I needed a creative outlet.
Well, this is like one of my favorite topics. I think it's super because I like you, spend a lot of years playing gigs in the trenches, and I think we musicians, we think of it as a creative job, but in a lot of ways, and especially like when I go sit in the bass section, creativity is a liability more than anything, right? And I'm like not being creative. I'm not picking the music. I'm just trying to blend in with everybody else. I'm just trying to punch the clock, just like everybody else. And for me, I look back at what I've done, and that was like the least creative thing I've done in my life. And it's interesting. So I think it's interesting when people make a shift from that world into something where your creativity is, more of the core.
Yeah. And it's hard to make the shift because let's face it, the thing that bass players like me will get hired for are those orchestral gigs. That's how we make our money. And so to pivot to experimental music, bass with computer music is you're really taking a chance in terms of your income. Because, sure, I played in a group like the 21st Century Ensemble, where you got paid. But, those groups are kind of ephemeral. They don't last forever. That group disbanded when the music director got an academic job in Indiana, not Indiana University, but Earlham College. Okay. And so when he left, the group just kind of disbanded because he was the driving force behind all of it. So, yeah.
So what on earth, I know I taught a class essentially in DJing, but that's about the extent of my electronic music background. And probably a lot of people are in a similar situation, but without the DJing class who are listening to this. So what's an electronic music, what did you do in school? What was your class? What were your classes like? What were you making? Just what's that whole experience like? Or was it like?
At Peabody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Peabody is a great place. Boy, where do I begin? First of all, it's a conservatory, so they want you to be a high-level performer and or composer or both. So you have to have that ability first before they'll even let you in to study computer music, because that's what sets them apart. After that, there are courses in digital music programming where at least at that time, the language was this language called Max MSP, and it's a visual programming language for audio. And so you would basically make software, I guess, for lack of a better word, that would enable you to create music. Then there's the digital synthesis class, which is the classic modeling in digital audio of acoustical principles, and then of course the studio techniques where you learn how to use a mixing board and stuff like that. And that's kind of the core of it. And there are a whole bunch of other classes like multimedia courses and things like that.
Well, so this Max MSP, which again, I know from a little bit of fooling around with Ableton Live, but I've looked at examples of what you can do with that. And I said, this is amazing. Like I can make a certain sound trigger lights, or I can make like, what are some examples of what you can build, or what have you built in that?
Okay. Well, Max MSP is one of those creative environments where, yes, you have to build anything you want, but you can build anything you want.
Yeah,
that's the neat thing. So it's a plus and a minus. Whereas most digital audio workstations like Ableton, they kind of confine you to a certain type of creativity, even though you can still do some great stuff in Ableton and other softwares. Max is just one of those things where you can basically recreate how you think and how you create. And so at least at that time, I was very, very interested in interactive computer music, and Max was the best way to enable myself to do that. So what I was doing was really trying to create computer software that will react to my playing, keep track of what I play, in this case my intervallic predilections and my improvisations. So when my UNO bio says improvisations with the computers was one of my favorite projects, it still is, I was either using software or making software that would listen to how I played and try to be my duet partner, driven by creative algorithms that have some kind of creative impetus to it.
So it's listening. No, it makes sense.
It's listening. Yeah.
This is like, these sound like conversations I hear at my co-working space in San Francisco, talking about VR and stuff like that. And I know that you were even, so you're improvising and the program is listening to what you're doing. It's listening to your rhythms, your pitches, or it's recording you, or or it's through MIDI.
I took the easy way, mainly intervallic predilection.
Okay.
Would detect, to make a long story short, if it sounded like I really liked the C major scale, it will gravitate towards C major.
Okay.
That kind of thing. Okay. That's its most basic application. And you have to make it simple, because if you don't, people don't really understand what you're trying to do. But the problem with a lot of computer music is that it's so complex that people don't really get what you're trying to do. And they won't understand all the work that you put into making it work, because it seems just so they can't connect with it in any way. But if you use structures that are a little bit more what they're familiar with, like simple major scale, and if there are any students out there listening, I tell them not to do that, but yet in my own creative practice, I do. Just because I don't want to alienate audiences either.
So, I'll include at the beginning and the end, Jeremy sent some examples. So you've already heard some of his playing, and you'll hear some more. But I listened to this music, and I went through and I was listening to some other things you have on SoundCloud and other channels. And so how much of what I'm hearing is written out, or has been, are you recreating something you've been practicing? Are you improvising on the spot? Is it a combination? Does it depend on the piece? Like how?
Those pieces were improvised.
Okay.
There is a predefined structure, but the structure is built into the software. So the software will limit how the computer will create. And that's kind of how we compose in computer music sometimes, is you limit the ability of the computer to think. So not that they're intelligent, but if they could be intelligent and can go any which direction, you constrain at the very least the randomness, because I'll admit a lot of what I do is driven by randomness. And if you constrain the randomness, you can then limit the computer's ability to make choices as it listens to you. Again, limiting it to the C major scale, for example, a major scale or a minor scale or a half diminished, limits the choices that a computer can make. And that does two things. It makes it more cogent for the listener, but I think also more cogent for me.
And how do you think of structure in this type of music? Are you thinking like ABA form, general? And I know I'm sure it differs, or is it more of like an evolving kind of A becomes B becomes C becomes D, or I like just how do you think? I don't know if that makes any sense, but how do you think of structure, either as you're improvising or when you're sitting down and programming?
Yeah, it's definitely continuous form. It's certainly not sectional.
Okay,
It would, if I were to do it sectional, I would probably have to force the computer to go to a different section. And you can do that with triggers, all kinds of triggers, but I prefer not to trigger the computer. I want it to try to think on its own, even though it's limited in its ability to think. I do want it to think on its own. But yes, you can certainly program it to, like, I can use a foot pedal to trigger something, or definitely. But I don't like to do that. I can, and I have, but it's not something I like to do.
Now, you have and continue to play orchestra stuff, and I think about this a lot myself. Now, and I want to talk about how you ended up at UNO and all that too, but just like the art form itself, or like what you do on the bass or creatively or playing in a section. Like, I feel like when I go play in a bass section now, and I write and I do all sorts of things, and I conducted for a while, I really looked at what I was doing in the bass section differently. Like, does creating this music and like really being a composer and improvising and just like, you really get to scratch that creative itch musically, it seems to me. How does it feel being in a bass section now and going back to that world versus like maybe back when you were freelancing in DC or in Shreveport? I don't know if that makes any sense, but like...
Oh, it makes sense. It's funny you use the word scratch because I used a lot of scratch tones.
Okay.
in not just Ponticello. It's funny, people used to call me the smack bash guy in DC who didn't know me as a bass player in the normal bass playing circles. Oh, you're the guy that smacks the bass around a lot with this. Yeah, I had a bow that didn't have any hair on it, and all I did was smack the bass with it. I had timpani mallets too. But did it change me? I don't think it did.
No.
I kept the worlds in terms of approaching bass playing in the section. I definitely kept the worlds separate.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has affected my teaching a lot, but not bass playing within a section.
How do you think it's affected your teaching? You're teaching on the bass?
I'm much more meticulous now. But I also know when not to be meticulous, which is probably the most important thing. It's computer music is the one art form where you can be meticulous down to the sample level, if you wanted to. But of course, a lot of that isn't perceptible. And so I could really analyze how sound is produced, not just through software, but just because you spend a lot of time at Peabody learning how sound is produced on acoustical instruments, because you learn how to replicate that digitally, even though your intent is not to replicate an acoustical instrument, because only an acoustical instrument can do that properly. As part of the intellectual pursuit, you try to replicate sound, so you begin to understand how sound is actually constructed, what it's actually made of. And so now I see a student, and I go deeper than the fingers. I really think about what the sound is. Now, I don't bore the students to death with all that. They can go take an acoustics class at our college, and then we can talk. And I have one student that's going to be doing that, actually. We're going to bring acoustics and bass together. But the ability to break down things, but more importantly, when not to get meticulous, when not to break down things, and to try to think of ways to teach a student that are not so exact, but instead using more intuitive methods. So I'm a much more intuitive person now because I understand the limitations of being meticulous. I was there in computer music trying to teach computers to feel and to have emotion, and doing it through these meticulous constructs. It doesn't work. You have to approach it as a human being and communicate with people as human beings, because your bass students will be performing for human beings. I didn't come to this realization until like after I learned all this computer music stuff. And I think our teachers probably told us that, but we didn't believe them because we were too busy trying to, there's a certain messianic, I almost want to say, do I dare say the word cult of computer music? Like Stockhausen, people like that.
Sure.
There's a certain aura about people like him, Columbia, Princeton, and Milton Babbitt, and Stanford, Karma. And there's a certain, I don't want to call it a cult, but there's a certain cohesiveness to the people that practice it. And if you're in it, you're just in it 500 million %. And I think that's part of it actually. And then you get involved in that, and then you step back and realize, whoa, it's so cool what we did, but what exactly are we trying to do? It's just like, and I still love doing that stuff, but you do have to step back and realize most of the world does not understand our language, nor do they understand us, and we're trying to communicate art to them. Okay, it's time to step back a little bit. And I think this is where my bass player part comes back. It's like, in playing in an orchestra, ultimately, I think, when an audience comes, if you want them to at least feel better after they leave. And that's really a minimum for anything that we do. So if someone comes to my recital and they feel better afterwards for some unknown reason, then I pretty much did my job, I think. And it's hard to do that with computer music. Not to bash it or anything. It's definitely an ivory tower kind of thing. Definitely.
Well, I've talked to a lot of musicians. I remember, violinists, whoever, who do a lot of contemporary music and then do not other styles too. And a lot of people, the phrase, "Oh, I don't like listening to that piece. I like playing it, but I don't like listening to it." I've heard that a lot from fellow freelancers and that sort of thing. I've always thought that's interesting. Just the audience perspective. And maybe part of it is I'm thinking of this conversation I was having with Norman Ludwin, the bass publisher. He was talking about writing music that people want to play, and even how composers going back over the last, over hundreds of years, that's part of what, and he was giving advice to people who wanted to write for film. It's like, look, when you finally have an orchestra in front of you, you want them to enjoy playing your music so that you can come back. It's something that maybe you think about too in the computer music or in the world you're in.
Yeah. I think in the world that I am still in, we're very obsessed about replicating what otherwise are really human actions, whether in the creative process or even in the listening process, because we can write software to analyze. And then when you attempt to try to make this perfect machine that has human elements, you realize a human being does it better. And so you kind of come full circle. And now I appreciate more the unquantifiable. Things that you can't quantify, things that you can't capture in an algorithm. That's the cool stuff. That's where the meaning is, because we're all doing tech now. Computer music's actually not something that is only accessible to a privileged few. You can go out and get some basic software and do a lot of this stuff now for very cheap. And so now that everyone's doing it, I think we're coming to the realization that I think we're appreciating more the human element of music. I certainly do. And so that's what I focus in on. So it's interesting that when I started playing orchestral bass more again, I'm really thinking more of that than, am I going to nail this stroke? I still have to do that to fit in. Otherwise they won't want me back. But there has to be something more than that in order for this music that we're playing to be better than the computer music. Computer music has its place, but in terms of emotional connection, there's no better group to do that than a bunch of human beings playing together on stage.
Yeah. Did you always think you were going to be doing something with your bass in this? Because when I think of what you do, I think it's like your bass and you're interacting with this software. Did you ever think, I'm just gonna, or do you write things totally away from the bass that are just like in that? Because what I see online that you've put out is always you in bass, and I sort of associate that with what you do. Did you always have in your mind, I want to still be playing this acoustic instrument, but I want to be working in this milieu?
I'm trying to think of when. No, not always. I'm just trying to think of when I really started to seriously think about doing it for real, And I think that going back to the beginning of the interview with Staten Adams.
Yeah, right, because that wasn't with bass. Yeah.
That wasn't with bass, but there was something there that was so exciting to me. And I don't think I ever really let go of the bass part. And I don't know if it really changed that much, especially within an orchestral context. I mean, when I do recitals, I think it changed me, solo recitals. But yeah, I think maybe I kept the world separate. They rarely converge. But it's hard to, gosh, I don't have an answer for that one really. Because because I don't know when it happened. I think the 21st Century Ensemble did it again. So it was just a confluence of a bunch of things again. Yeah. I think in terms of that, but that's just in terms of pure creative expression. In terms of career-wise, it's much more directed. Did I ever see myself doing it as a career? Yeah, but I didn't know what exactly form that would take, but it became pretty obvious as I was looking in the Chronicle of Higher Education for jobs that if something like music tech is attached to your bass playing, people are going to want to hire you, at least back in 2005 when I was looking for work as an academic. And certainly that was probably part of it. I think the careerist aspect kind of pointed me in that direction too, although at that time I was still doing it for pure art's sake. I'd like to think I was, just because I liked it. But yeah, oh gosh, now that I think about it, I still remember, okay, someone's going to kill me for saying this, but I remember we were doing De Valkyrie, Washington National Opera, or Kennedy Center Opera House, whatever it's called. It seems to change names every 5 years. And both my stand partner and I were late to the gig, and the opening, the prelude to the first act is probably one of the most important bass licks in the opera. And instead of 6 bass players, there were 4, and 2 of us were not there because of a really bad rainstorm. And we left like 2 hours before. It was like, how many hours do we have to leave? Do we have to camp out the night before? So I was just like, so we showed up late, missed it, and I was just like, I turned to my stand partner who was also late, and I say, I can't do this anymore. This is just horrible. I've never had a conductor come up to me and chew me out, ever, at a break. The conductor was nice about it. He was chewing me out in his own nice German way. So it was like, okay, I'm going to look at the Chronicle of Higher Education a little bit harder, because this music tech thing seems to have some promise, and I like doing it. So I think that the confluence of all these things, you add that careerist aspect, and here I am.
So I want to hear about, and again, probably most people haven't applied for academic jobs who are listening to this podcast. A few certainly have. But just adding on to your rainstorm, you're reminding me of my freelance road warrior days. The Northwest Indiana Symphony had in their contract, they may still have this, what's called the butter truck clause. What it is they were, rehearsal. Everybody heads from Chicago to Northwest Indiana to play. Most people are coming from there. Kid you not, butter truck overturned on the freeway, and butter escaped and was all over the freeway. So it caused the worst traffic jam you can conceive of. And
are you speaking metaphorically, or is it real butter?
Literal, actual butter truck. I don't know whether it was liquid butter in the truck or whether it was sticks that went out on the highway, but it basically, the whole orchestra didn't even make it to the gig. And so it's kind of like an active God sort of thing in the clause. Yeah. It's like, okay, if something catastrophic like a butter truck overturning happens, it's okay. No harm, no foul. We get it. So
butter truck turning over and stopping an entire orchestra from, you can't make this stuff up. Stuff like this has to actually happen.
What's it like applying for jobs in academia? What was your experience like? You mentioned the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and just maybe walk us through, you're finishing at Peabody. What'd you do next? How did your career unfold?
First of all, a lot has changed. I mean, I really do consider myself a dinosaur, because I was a recession hire, and everything changed after the recession was over. So everything I say might not be completely applicable. For example, I only have a master's. I couldn't get a job today in academia. I would have a much harder time today if I went out without a doctorate in hand. So anyone out there listening thinking they can do it without a doctorate like me, it's probably not a good idea today. But 13 years ago or 15 years ago, perfectly fine. You could. And so, yeah, I finished Peabody, and I think I applied for 7 jobs that I could even remotely was qualified for, and I only got 1 interview, and fortunately they hired me, and it was not UNO. It was this place called Sauk Valley Community College, which is west of Chicago. So I was going back to Illinois again. To a place called Dixon, Illinois, and that's where I really cut my teeth. My first couple of years tours of duty in academia as a part-time person, I'll be honest, I really didn't think I knew what I was doing, and I made a lot of mistakes. And fortunately, I was still just a bass player, so that was okay. I wasn't doing too much damage in the academy. But Sauk Valley Community College was just a great place to cut your teeth. And the interesting thing about that job is, even though it was a community college, you just learned how to be a music academic. Even though it was just a community college, you learned how to be a music academic. But more importantly, this was the interesting part. When I started doing interviews for 4-year colleges up through university jobs, all of a sudden, my phone was ringing. I had 10 campus interviews while I was at Sauk for university jobs. And it always went back to the community college experience. People knew that I could do the job at their university because I lived the life of an assistant professor doing all the crazy things that music academics do. And yeah, I agree with them. And what was more interesting is how many faculty on the university level that I met got their starts at community colleges also. Now, you can't do this in the sciences because you need good labs for research, but in music you can, I think. I don't know if this story would work today, to be honest. But that's how I learned how to be an academic, was on the community college level. And then I went to UNO after that. But I was actually just in Dixon recently, too, on the way back from Chicago. I liked living there a lot. I lived in Sterling, Illinois, but I have a lot of fond memories of the place. And it's very quiet because most urban areas have a noise level that people don't even realize there's noise because they're just so accustomed to it, until you go to a place like Sterling or Dixon in the Sauk Valley area, when you actually hear quiet for real. Besides our recording studio at UNO, which is very quiet. But outside of that artificial space, it's very noisy in Omaha. You go out and you hear the highway. I mean, it's just, you just get so accustomed to it, you don't think of it as anything. It's kind of like if you live next to the L in an apartment next to the L in Chicago, you don't notice the train anymore, but it's there.
Yeah, I was going to ask what that experience was like coming from like DC, like a major metro, Baltimore, East Coast, that, of course, you grew up in a more, slightly quieter, but still there's got to be a big difference between Dixon, Illinois, or Sterling, Illinois, and even Kansas City suburbs,
Yeah, but it was wonderful.
Yeah.
The commute was so easy. I lived, how many miles did I live away from the Kennedy Center? I think 9 or something. Yet it took me an hour, and I'm not including the time getting from my Kennedy Center parking spot to the gig. It was the commutes all of a sudden disappeared when I lived in Sterling, and I never felt stressed out on the road. It was so nice.
You don't realize how much time and how much just stress there is having to do something like that. And here living in downtown San Francisco, I'm fully aware of that that stress.
Oh, and it's not just the stress. You start to do some dumb things, unavoidable dumb things. I remember when I was living in Chicago, I'd go up to Milwaukee once in a while to play with the Milwaukee Symphony up there, and you can only plan your day so much to build in time for commuting. There's only so much time you can build, and otherwise you're just commuting. And so I was cutting it a little close one day, and so I was walking a little too fast down the steps with my bass. And next thing you know, my bass is squashed, $6,000 of repairs. Fortunately, the insurance paid for it, but I had to do the embarrassing thing up in Milwaukee. Katie, can I borrow your extra bass? We're about to play Mahler or something like that. And it's just like, oh, jeez. Yeah, and that's from just being in a hurry all the time because you're trying to cut corners on your commute because you don't want to be living on the road, Yeah. And as great as of an experience it was to play up there, it was pretty taxing getting on that highway, especially in the winters.
Man, well, you're speaking my language. That's we could share multiple Milwaukee road warrior stories. I remember I got to, because I played in the Milwaukee Ballet for 7 years, and anyone who has, if you're not familiar with that part of the country, it snows a lot, especially during ballet season. And I remember driving up, and it was one of those. It's just like you're saying, like, okay, what am I going to leave at noon, to get to my 7 p.m. gig or whatever. So, I left at 4 on a snowy day, which I learned to leave earlier than that. So I got stuck in Chicago traffic. Then there was an accident. Then I get to Milwaukee, and we're like 5 minutes till the gig or something. Somehow find parking, running with my bass. I did not fall on my bass or anything, but like I remember some audience people were like mocking me. They're like, "Oh, go bass player, run bass," and I was like, great. I was just like stressed out for 3 hours, and now I'm getting taunted by the audience as I'm like running into the place.
Oh, jeez.
I remember coming out from Milwaukee and someone broken into my car, not the same time, but another, and then another time in snow, and then I'll shut up about Milwaukee. So, but like I had this car with no just this Ford Escort with no traction control or anything, and I almost got stuck in Milwaukee because I couldn't get onto the freeway. I was like trying to get up. There was like this 10 inches of snow, and I'm zoom, and I keep sliding back, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to get home. I can't even get on the freeway. So finally somehow I did. But
yeah, this sounds so familiar, and yet the story is also shared by other people that drove up there to play gigs in Milwaukee from Chicago. They did the same thing, and it was just all perfectly normal. That was just part. If you wanted to play in that orchestra's up there, that's just something you had to do if you insisted on living in Chicago. So, but it doesn't make it better just because everyone else is doing it too. And so going back to that, what was it like moving to Dixon? Whether it's Chicago or DC, you're dealing with this commute, and you do all the tricks so you don't have to be on the road so much. And and not having to do that was just awesome. My daughter was just born, and then eventually my son not soon afterwards. And so we raised them peace and quiet, and it was just a good start to a good start to something else. Not having to commute. Now I'm complaining about commuting again. Not that Omaha is a very big city. It's a medium-sized city, but we've got our commuting problems too. And I'm thinking to myself, this isn't so bad. I was just in Chicago a couple days ago. Compared to Chicago, this is nothing. I will stop complaining.
Well, even my hometown of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, not too far from Omaha, has got rush hour issues and stuff. And I've even gotten onto 41st Street, one of these main streets, and I'm like stuck in traffic. And I thought, how can I be stuck in traffic in Sioux Falls? What is this insanity? But I've always liked Omaha. Folks, I've mentioned in the intro, but I just was out at UNO. Jeremy was kind enough to invite me out to talk to students there, and my dad taught in Omaha at UNO. So I've always enjoyed that city, and it's one of those cities that it's big enough to have big city offerings and have things to do and have culture, but it's not a 9 million, 10 million, megapolis where your 9-mile commute can take 2 hours.
Sioux City has a prettier river, I think, than we do.
I like that.
We can actually, our river's too big to appreciate other than to look at it. But no, I've been up to Sioux City, and it's a fantastic city. Haven't been up there in a while, but I really enjoy trips up there. And every time I went up there, wait a minute, Sioux City or Sioux Falls? Which one are we talking about?
Sioux Falls, both Sioux City and Sioux Falls are nice. I'm from Sioux Falls, but Sioux City is the one is in between. So halfway, there's Sioux City. We're gonna get into some Midwest trivia here for folks that don't know. There are 3 Sioux cities. There is Sioux City, Iowa, which is the big Sioux City. There's Sioux City, Nebraska, which is smaller, and there's Sioux City, South Dakota, and they all are connected by the Missouri, I think, and the Big Sioux River. And actually, a portion of the Big Sioux River is named J. Heath Memorial Riverway or whatever. And after my dad was a really big canoeing enthusiast, and so this chunk of that river. So it's always fun to go back to that part of time. So I'm from Sioux Falls, but I used to play in the Sioux City Symphony. So Sioux Falls, I think they both have pretty rivers, actually. So I'm not sure what Sioux Falls has. The falls, so that's probably the more spectacular one.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Sioux Falls, but Sioux City has its stuff too. Yeah. How did we start talking about Sioux City?
Small towns, Omaha, and then just
it's a balance between the big city of DC or Chicago versus Sterling, Illinois. I think I found my happy medium. I mean, I've been here 13 years now, so it's a nice place to live. Des Moines is also another one of those nice places to live. I don't live there, but it's another one of those towns where it's medium sized. It's got a lot of cultural offerings and sports and whatever, but still not the kind of thing that where you pull your hair out going to work,
Right.
Because Oh, geez. I don't know how I did it in DC. Now that I think about it, it's like, how did I commute? And it's like, it was only 9 miles. Yet it was so hard to get to gigs. And that was the Kennedy Center were the closest ones. If I wanted to go farther into DC, because that was right along the Potomac and I lived in Northern Virginia, it was even more time, but it really wasn't that far. But yeah, you leave the National Art Gallery orchestra gig and there'd be this big traffic jam. It'd take you 2 hours to get home because all the people looking at the cherry blossoms and you're sitting there going, tourists.
A question I like to ask people on the podcast is what advice would they give their 18-year-old self? And here's Barry Kolstein of Kolstein & Sons answering that very question.
I think as an 18-year-old and, or even in my early 20s coming into the shop, everything like that, a lot of it was laid out for me. There was a plan, that I was given a plan, which I often say I've done a good job and I'm proud of what I've done with the shop, and I continue to be proud. But, I was given an opportunity, and I always respect self-made people, that weren't given that opportunity. It's what you do with the opportunity.
Barry has been providing bassists with opportunities through beautiful instruments, bows, cases, you name it. He's been doing this himself for 50 years, and the shop is celebrating their 70th year in business. Thank you so much for what you do, Barry. Check them out at Kolstein.com, and thank you for sponsoring the podcast. How is it that Upton Bass came to design a bass for Gary Carr? Well, it all started with an email. Here's Eric and Gary from Upton Bass on how this happened.
Gary was at kind of the forefront of ergonomics in commissioning different bass makers to make ergonomic models to his playing style. And he basically replied. And he said, yeah, but here's what I'm looking for. I want something, that's this, and this.
He sent us sketches.
Oh, and by the way, I want it affordable that anyone going to my car camp could afford it.
This model has become so popular, and Gary Carr even played it for the 50th anniversary International Society of Bassists convention. He was the opening, he gave the keynote speech, and he played 2 beautiful selections on his Upton Bass, his Carr model Upton Bass. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Bass players tend to look for bows in slightly different ways than other string players. Here's A440's Michael Spadero on what he's observed with bassists looking for bows.
Here's one thing I've noticed over the years. Violinists and cellists tend to gravitate toward more expensive bows, and with bass players, I give them as little information as possible, and a lot of times they'll end up selecting a $200 bow that feels great to them and works really well with their instrument.
Learn more about the selection of bows and basses and everything else online at a440violinshop.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Yeah, that reminds me of all my musician friends that live in Oakland and Berkeley, and they come into San Francisco to do work. And it's one of my friends says you always have to leave room for more than one standard deviation in traffic. So it's like there could be an accident on the Bay Bridge and something like that, and then you're totally hosed. So
it's, and sometimes you have to be the out-of-towners, talking to them. People take for granted how awesome the Bay Bridge is. Just looking at it is so awesome. Yep. But some people look at it that live there as the bane of their existence because of the bottleneck where everyone has to get on this bridge. It's like, no, I think it's kind of cool when I went over it, but I wasn't commuting to a gig, so I guess no.
Yeah, I commute infrequently enough over it that I still have that kind of wow, this is cool. I'm on the Bay Bridge. If I did it every day, I'd probably not think that so much. But
yeah, I think we all just take for granted what's good about where we are. There were so many good things about DC, yet I took it for granted, and so then I only saw the commuting part, but really, like talking about the National Art Gallery gig was, the commuting was awful, but geez, the warm-up room was the Renaissance painting room. That's so you got to see all these great Renaissance painters, Botticelli and all that stuff, and just warming up. And it's like, wow, this is kind of cool. And it's like, I should have dwelled more on that part. Yeah. But I'm just one of those people where part of the reason I do Des Moines Opera every year, I figure out why I'm so happy there and why I've done it for two decades plus, is there's no commute. Mm-hmm. I go to my job and there's no commute. You can walk there with your bass, or if you want to drive, it's takes 3 minutes. So,
it's nice.
Yeah.
It's nice not having, well, you mentioned, earlier, and then we were talking about this when I was in Omaha too, but combination of like you do two things. Well, you do many things, but you have the computer and you are in two different areas of campus at UNO. And it reminds me of Scott Adams' an article he wrote a long time ago, creator of Dilbert, about how you the secret sauce in so many things in life is like being really good or highly proficient in two areas, right? And so like by combining two things, that unlocks a lot of doors, you know, whether, so maybe for you, technology and bass. And I'm curious, because I think you mentioned in Omaha that this is doing bass plus something else is a really common thing. And I think about some other people I know, like I used to teach adjunct at University of Wisconsin Whitewater, and Benjamin Whitcomb is cello and music theory and something else. I mean, like how common is your setup? I guess that's the short question.
I would say that there aren't very many, but if you do apply to be a full-time academic, you're talking academia here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even though there aren't really that many jobs compared to, let's say, orchestra playing, I'd say at least half of them want you to do something else. Because let's face it, the violinist can have a studio of 20, but you have to be at a really, really, really big school where all you do is teach 20 bass players. Right. And I'm not so sure I'd want to do that anyway. My wife told me my first year here as I went out the door, this is not Indiana. You're not Bruce Bransby. You've got a small studio. That's what it is. Handle it that way. It's not, you're not going to get 20 bass players and, you know, in your studio. And she was right. So a lot of us have to, you know, maybe we'll do string methods. I've had to teach string methods 1 year. Jazz is probably the most common thing that goes along with bass playing. Yeah. And music theory is another popular one. And you don't even have to get a degree in music theory. I mean, you could be a really smart dude like Andrew Cohn and get a PhD in music theory, but most of us aren't of his intellectual level. But you can still get a DMA in bass. And if you took a lot of music theory and maybe was a graduate assistant in music theory, then you can get one of those jobs too, with bass being your central thing. And it's funny you bring up that article because we teach in the information science college because my music tech part is housed in information science. We teach what IBM calls the T-shaped professional. We are deep in one discipline, but you have to be able to communicate with, touch, and be part of, and be relevant to others through cross-disciplinary competencies like communication or design or certain business principles. So using other disciplines to connect with other disciplines, you don't have to be fantastic at those other ones, but you have to be able to work collaboratively with them, because that's how you solve really, really big problems. Yeah. And I think that's probably a more updated version of what people say when they want to bring together two disciplines. It's really be really good at one, but always figure out what it is that you're doing can be important to someone else, and be able to figure out, this is the hard part, how to connect with them. That's the hard part. How do you connect with them? And I think right now what I try to tell people on both sides of the colleges that I teach in is that emotional resonance is probably one of the more important competencies. Being able to understand emotional resonance is one of the most important competencies I think that artists can provide to other disciplines, no matter what it is. It can be technology, business, or psychology. The one thing that we can't quantify, if you remember earlier, is, you know, what makes us human. Can't quantify it. Who are the people that have been frolicking and working in that area for centuries? The artists, the musicians. We work in the unquantifiable. It's just we do a terrible job of connecting what we do so well with the needs of other disciplines. The emotional resonance part, we're experts, but we do it in very intuitive terms, and we should. But somehow we need to translate that to the design process. Design process is in engineering, you know, design thinking coming out of Stanford, and how what we do is part of the empathy process, and that we understand the meaning of something beyond, you know, our phone is a phone, it's functional, but there's an identity meaning there. There's a agency meaning. Same thing with our music. But in music, it's all meaning. It's no function necessarily. There's implementation. How do we make the sound? But certainly we can't put a function on it. But there's definitely meaning, and we all recognize it. We just haven't quite figured out what it is yet. Even the practitioners don't know what it is, but we know it moves people. And the places like the engineers are trying to capture that, but they don't have the artistic training. So hence, they're looking to the artists, the musicians. Partly why I'm down there, down in the Information Science College, is to help figure that part out that artists have been doing forever.
Somebody that comes to mind that's done a really good job of integrating music into various other disciplines is like Ben Zander, The Art of Possibility, and his TED Talks.
Yeah.
Some other people too, even Justin Locke, bass player.
I love his stuff.
Yeah, so
and he's entertaining. He's still my favorite podcast guest of yours, just because the guy should have been a stand-up comedian on the side. Maybe he was. I don't know.
I need to get in touch with it. Next time when I'm in Boston, we'll get together and we'll break out the mics and record.
Yeah. It's just, that guy is just such a happy guy, and he just had such a great sense of humor, and just the way he looked at things. And you have to appreciate people that I've never even met this guy, but you have to appreciate people that can like talk about anything that we just look as mundane, but make it interesting. It's like he could talk about bagging a sack of groceries and make it interesting. That's the kind of guy he is. Yeah. One of these days I got to meet him. Oh, well.
Yeah, we need to get him out to a bass convention.
Yes.
That would be a good way, because I can't say enough good things about him. Again, most people probably aren't on the academic path listening, but even those that are would probably find it interesting. What did you find particularly surprising about the job you have, this job, or jobs like what you do at UNO in general? What do you think people probably don't realize about what your life is like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, my job's kind of weird. So maybe I'll try to figure out something that I've found other people in my field talk about too, is the most surprising thing. Oh, I know. I'll have to go back to my, Sauk Valley days. That's because that was really my first full-time academic job. Here was the most surprising thing. I thought I was cruising on easy streets. Like, I looked at my teaching schedule. I'm going, man, I only have to be on campus 3 days a week in like the morning from about 10 o'clock till about 2. It's like, this is an easy gig. I wish someone would have told me there was all this other stuff that went along with it. I had read about it. I'd heard about it, but I really didn't know, Fortunately, I caught on pretty quickly. Again, that was a great job for cutting my teeth and really figuring out what it takes to do the job day to day. And so then I realized, I have to be there a lot, doing all kinds of things: recruiting, committee work, paperwork. There are all kinds of reporting functions that are required by federal agencies, because anytime a university takes even one dime or one penny from a federal agency or state agency, those agencies want accountability. And so there's some kind of paperwork you've got to fill out that gets sent up the food chain and then sent back to them. For example, and for those out there that teach in institutions that have this word called assessment, which is a different way to assess learning, but besides just grades, it's a more of an enterprise-wide approach to assessing learning, more data-driven. And I didn't know anything about that stuff. And someone told me about No Child Left Behind. It's like, this is what No Child Left Behind is? Okay, show me how to fill this stuff out. And and it took me a while to learn how to do that stuff. So, what surprised me was that it was a lot more work than I thought, because what I observed from the outside looking in as a part-timer was I really didn't know what the full-timers were actually doing. It just seemed like they were having an easy job.
Well, I always wondered myself, especially I've had a series of part-time gigs. I would go into my little hole and teach bass and run away. And I always wondered what the people behind those office doors were doing. But I sort of suspected as much. And committee work and
a lot of the committee work's governance. Professors are supposed to be in charge of, especially curriculum, things like that, and they have a direct hand in who gets hired and things. But that also takes additional work. So when governance is part of your job, and it should be, nobody should ever turn down service when it comes to governing the curriculum. that takes even more work. The responsibility of being in charge of curriculum is, it's not an easy task. So I had no idea that it was that hard. I didn't know that someone really had to think about curriculum. I thought it was just magic. So yeah, it was a surprise to me. And fortunately, when I came to UNO, I'd learned all that stuff already. So there was really no surprise when I came to UNO. I knew exactly what to expect. I think the surprise came in my first job as a full-time person at Sauk Valley Community College when you think you know everything, but you don't. That's just what I was. And the thing is, I can tell that story for every job I've ever had. I thought I knew everything, but I don't. And I bet you when I retire, I'll talk about the UNO job. I thought I knew everything, but I didn't.
The older I get, the less I'm sure I know anything at all.
Yeah, and that's actually the path to enlightenment and humility. You learn so much as you can, and the more you learn and realize, the less you know, and you come to a point where you have to be humble again because you let go to the fact that I really don't know anything. I have no right to feel like I'm superior to anything or anybody. I really don't know anything. But you have to go through that process of trying to learn as much as you can before you come to that stage. And even then, that belief may be part of a flawed belief system too. Maybe I don't know enough to know that what I just said was a bunch of, hooey. But it's what I tell my children.
Yep.
And what I tell my students too. I believe it to be true, but I won't really know until the end, will I?
Well, we have far too many topics to talk about. So round 2 in the future for sure, but for sure if you're down. But
definitely.
One thing that I love to, because you've been in academia 15 years.
Yes.
Roughly. Okay. So
full-time 15 years.
Okay. And so if we go back then, or certainly go back to when you and I were in college, I got my bass degree and the advice was, good luck, good luck out there. I was down, it was this month actually, at UNO and you have this entrepreneurship program series and bring people in. And so I just love, because I think that's something that I've been interested in for a long time.
You're part of the reason for that, It's like, you wrote that chapter at the end of your book and, this entrepreneurship in colleges is really a relatively new thing. And when we were thinking about this track, I would cite your chapter, which is in our library, by the way.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And it's like, this guy's been talking about it. And this was like, you wrote that in 2006. So entrepreneurship in college programs, that was still kind of still kind of a budding thing. And nobody really knew what that would look like, but we were definitely talking about it. And at least I had something to point to because your book was really the only thing I knew of that talked about this stuff. And so that was how I was informed and how I contributed my discussions.
Wow.
I hope my colleagues don't hear this because they'll think that I got everything from you, and I did.
Well, I'm honored that you have that in your library, that you've referenced that. And if folks don't know what we're talking about, I wrote a book back in the mid 2000s called Road Warrior Without an Expense Account, chronicling my frustrations about what Jeremy and I have been talking about, and just how.
But the best was at the end, the chapter on entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, because that was most of the book was me just carping about how everything is work. But then I did, the last chapter of this book was about trying to build something to prepare students. And I think it's an interesting thing. And it's cool to watch from an outside perspective, me not being in academia, to see that started to get adopted. So it's a different landscape now than it was.
Yes. Back then. Yeah. Okay. And they're just all over the place now, entrepreneurship programs, and nobody's really sure what it's going to look like at their university, but they're definitely talking about it. They're trying to think of ways. The College Music Society, for example, it is now a central topic to a lot of those conferences. People really are sincerely wanting to know how to prepare musicians for the entrepreneurial life too. Because let's face it, Beethoven and Mozart were entrepreneurs. They were all entrepreneurs. We didn't get into this idea of siloed specialization until I think probably, I don't know, around World War II, after World War II, possibly. But most people were usually entrepreneur types, so portfolio types. I think the word today is portfolio musicians, where they do multiple things. And that's actually the way it used to be for the longest time, I think. And so we're just basically going back to how it was. like what Mozart was doing.
I was listening to a Berkeley entrepreneurship talk from whoever's in charge of that program at Berkeley in Boston, and he was mentioning, the word entrepreneur was first applied to musicians. That was the impresarios that were setting up concerts. That was the first usage that people have found of that word. So we're the original entrepreneurs.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I might be wrong on that. I think I'm right. I'll blame that Berkeley guy if I'm wrong. But
oh, that's great. That's good to know. I'll have to look that one up. That's interesting. Huh.
I think the tough thing, and this is something I've thought about, is, and you were talking about the T career, right? Like being really specialized in something,
T-shaped,
but T-shaped career, and you don't want to build like. I think the solution is not to have everybody running around wearing this so-called musical entrepreneur hat, but then they can't play their scales in tune or they don't know any rep.
Right.
So it's definitely a tough balancing act. I think there's beauty, no matter what you do in your life, in really going just full bore on something and really becoming a master at something.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing. And then you're like, well, the schedule is full. What do we take away to make this entrepreneurship happen? Or how do we augment, or how do we fit it in? So, I know that nobody's probably figured it out exactly yet. People are experimenting.
I can tell you what we did.
Yeah. So what do you do?
Okay. And I had mentioned Andrew Cohn earlier, so now he's going to hate me for saying this. We took out some music theory courses.
Okay.
Upper level music theory. We took them out to make room. That's not to say that learning your enharmonic modulations using a German augmented sixth chord is not important. It's certainly important. It's stuff like that. You do have to make room somewhere.
Right. That's the thing. Yeah.
And we did it with theory courses. I think we cut out a music history course. So yes, all my musicology, music theory friends will think I'm insane now, but yeah, you do have to cut it out somewhere, and it's hard to let go. And we couldn't let it go until a cohort of faculty that were all hired at the same time back in the 1970s, all retired at the same time. Then we could make the changes. So I became senior faculty very quickly after a mass wave of retirements, and a lot of us who were the same age were all thinking the same about this entrepreneurship thing. And we saw some other few models that were out there, in addition to articles like yours and that in your book. We were able to piece something together, and then we had to have the tough conversation. What are we going to cut out? And to this day, I'm going, it had to be done, because we also have that 4-year graduation imperative where they got to be out in 4 years.
Right. No, that's interesting, and I love. I'll make sure to also link to. I had in my opinion, a really great interview several years ago with a trombonist named, I believe, Matt Waters is his last name, but he wrote something called "The Orchestral Dream Is Dead." Chronicling chronicling, which is actually, it's a pretty good title. Chronicling the frustrations, kind of like what we were describing, or what I wrote about in my Road Warrior book, and it was interesting. And so his thought was, maybe they should cut out a couple music theory classes. Because I asked him the same thing I asked you. Is like, well, where do we alter? So not sorry, all music theorists out there, but we're just trying to find solutions.
Cohn, don't hate me. And other theorists I know that like theory. I like theory too. I had to teach it at Sauk Valley Community College. I loved it, but somewhere along the line, if they're really good at enharmonic modulation's wonderful, but they also need to eat.
Yes.
And all the knowledge in the world will just sit in the drawer and not get out there. All the expression will not get out there if the artist can't sustain a most basic, modest living. Then they can't create if they can't, make some kind of living at it. And so that's what the entrepreneurship thing really is. It's not a business degree. It's a way to facilitate expression that otherwise may not be able to get out there.
Right. And I think about that often these days when I go to play a gig or whatever. I think this is somebody created this opportunity that I am taking advantage of. And so somebody was the entrepreneur who started the San Francisco Symphony, or who started Present Music in Milwaukee or whatever. And I did an interesting experiment a few years ago. I don't know why I did this, but I took my old college transcripts and I thought about everything I'd done in the past couple of decades, and I thought about what I took that I have used the most in college, and I thought about what I wished I'd had. Not that we need everything in college to be directly tied to a practical job, but it was so fascinating because I was like, what did I use the most? Writing, this creative writing class I took. What do I desperately wish I had more of? Conducting and piano. Because for someone who doesn't play piano, I've banged away at a piano a lot more than I ever thought I would. And I've waved a stick. I probably made more money conducting than I have playing bass, even still, given the various things I've done.
Piano can be fun too.
Yeah. Yes.
You play all those pop tunes from your youth.
Yep.
And that was the neat thing about I was complaining when I flunked my first semester of piano keyboard at Indiana. And it's like, no, they wanted you to be good enough so that not only were you functional, but to this day, it's like I can enjoy playing through a few, pop piano tunes. And I accompanied my son on his first Suzuki recital. That was so awesome. Mm-hmm. No, it wasn't a recital. It was a competition. And it was really great experience. And even though class piano had absolutely nothing to do with my career, it had everything to do with my personal life in terms of that particular moment. And so it's like, wow. After I was all done, it was just like my parents, I remember that he performed for my parents. And then it's like all this bass stuff, all this computer music stuff, just great. The State and Adams thing that I talked about, my father first asked me, did you get paid for that? Or, he didn't really care. But when I accompanied my son on the piano, it's like all of a sudden that money that my dad spent to send me to IU was worth it.
Wow.
And it's like, wow, all because they flunked me in class piano because they wanted me to be better than I was. I was mad at the time, but it's just like, wow, I guess it does enhance your life when you have standards and make kids learn what they really should, even if they think they shouldn't be learning it. So, right. I should probably start donating to my as an alumni now. Yeah, I think I did already, but just not very much.
I think about that myself. Maybe we could wrap up, and again, there are probably like 9 topics we could chat about for hours. We haven't even brought up, but I only have one question that I traditionally ask. So let's go back to Jeremy. Starting Indiana maybe is a good age.
Oh, sure.
For freshman year.
I'll lose you again.
Oh no, am I here? Am I back? Can you hear
you're
me?
buzzing, which means you're.
I'm buzzing.
Oh no, you're good now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. What? All right.
FaceTime. Why are you failing me? Go back and give that young Jeremy some advice, if you have any.
If I have any. Oh, jeez. I've been listening to your podcast. I should have known this question was coming. What advice? I'm a person that lives without regrets, so I don't really think about this. I know what it is. And I actually saw it etched on the wall in graffiti back when people still used the walls for graffiti. You don't have anything to communicate if there's nothing you can communicate in your music if you haven't lived what it is you're trying to communicate, I guess. Mm-hmm. So it probably was more pronounced at Peabody. So maybe I can answer.
Yeah, of course.
Peabody was just like, they told us, don't get stuck in the computer music silo. It's very easy for computer musicians to be in the ivory tower and never talk to anyone. Of course, I just stayed in the 3rd floor of the Peabody Conservatory in the computer music studios because it was just a great place to be. And I hardly talked to anyone until it was about to graduate. And then I met all these great people I was hanging out with. It's like, I should have been hanging with you guys from the get-go. But the faculty told me I should do that. And I think Indiana was the same way. I should have spent more time hanging out with more different types of people instead of being isolated in the music school, because Indiana is this big university with all kinds of stuff. It's not just a music school. It's a real university with other people. And we as music majors there didn't really avail ourselves of the opportunities. I certainly didn't, of what and I'm not just talking about fun. I'm just like enriching yourself outside of the classroom just by meeting an accounting major, and seeing and hanging out with them, stuff like that.
That reminds me of a story Jeff Radisich told me. He was some bass player student years ago, but just never left the practice room. And Jeff said, "How will you know what a babbling brook sounds like? And bring into your music. How will you know if you don't get out in the world?" And the bass player just said, "Basses don't babble." It's like,
oh, you're so right. I don't think I ever heard the babbling brook that ran right by the music school. Now that I think about it. Yeah, I didn't really pay attention. I was so focused on, I got to make that low E string speak on the Beethoven 5 trio, and that's just all we were obsessed with. And so we were obsessing with trying different strings, rosin, and but that's what you had to do there. That was the culture, and that's why people were getting bass jobs left and right out of that school, is because we were committed. So I may have given myself bad advice to young Jeremy by doing so.
Maybe, but I don't know. I think there's something to be said for getting out there in the world and just experiencing things and experiencing concerts. And I remember Rex Martin, who tuba professor at Northwestern, talking about how important it was to get out and go to the Art Institute and go see those things.
Yes.
And so,
especially in Chicago. Yeah. It was etched on the wall, and I don't know why it was seared into my brain. So it was just planted there, where if you're not out there living life, then you have nothing to communicate in your music. I think that's what it says. What it read, and I still remember it to this day. There's some truth to that. Yet at the same time, you got to practice 4 hours a day. It's like, right. And you got to sleep, because if you don't get enough sleep, and so, I mean, you studied with Bransby a little bit. You know what he's like. You've got to be committed. Otherwise, I'm sorry, you studied with Mr. Bransby. Yeah. I don't think Mr. Bransby knows that we refer to him as Bransby when he's not around, but it's Mr. Bransby when he's around, even at our advanced stage. Even if you get a major symphony job, you still have to call him Mr. Bransby. So
it's true.
With someone like Mr. Bransby, who was, as he likes to use the word, fussy about everything, I don't know how I was supposed to go out there and hear that babbling brook. I was just too busy trying to make this bass E string speak so that it would sound clear enough so someone would want to give me a job so I can get paid, so then I can express myself. Otherwise, my artistic creativity would have remained in the drawer. So it's a balancing act. I don't know. I don't know if my advice was any good to young Jeremy. Well, but I think the Jeremy at Peabody would have been good advice, definitely, because I missed out socially on so many people that I think I would have had enriching connections with, that I'm only getting to know today, but I think would have been much better had I, hung out with them more at Peabody. But then again, I don't know if I would have gotten this job here at UNO if I didn't spend all my time, in that studio making stuff.
Jeremy, thank you so much for chatting. Folks, learn more about everything he's up to at baguyos.com. That's his website, and we've got that linked up in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. I have such a great time, and I learned so much doing these podcasts, and it's so cool to know that people from all over the globe, actually, are listening to this show. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Maybe this is your first episode. Maybe this is your 645th or whatever number we're on, but I just thank you so much. I appreciate it. I know Jeremy appreciates it. And reach out. Let me know a little bit about yourself, where you're from, suggest a guest. That would be great. And you can get in touch with me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. By the way, if you go to our website, contrabassconversations.com, you can share this episode to friends or family or social media or anything like that, or students or anyone you think would be interested. And that's how this show grows. So I really appreciate every time folks do that. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And Mitch makes beautiful award-winning basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper for archiving and cataloging everything we talk about on this show. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.